Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is Sunday, September 21st, 2025, and we have a fascinating conversation in store for you on Euro-Transhumanism and what it can teach us about the philosophy of transhumanism in general, as well as some applications to American politics, because here in the United States, we are experiencing one of the most turbulent political periods in our history, certainly the most turbulent political period in my lifetime thus far, and we could benefit from any insights that we can get about how to improve this situation. So joining us today is our panel of distinguished U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, advisors, and members, including our Director of Visual Art, Ramon Garcia, our Technology Advisor and Foreign Ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero, and our friend David Wood, who is the founder of the London Futurists and the executive director of LEVF, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. Our special guest today is Dr. Stefan Lorenz Sorgner. He is a world-leading philosopher recognized for his work in posthumanism, transhumanism, Nietzsche, and the philosophy of music. He is especially known for his interpretations of Friedrich Nietzsche and his critical engagement with human enhancement and emerging technologies. He is a philosophy professor at John Cabot University in Rome, director and co-founder of the Beyond Humanism Network, and a fellow and advisor of numerous organizations, as well as editor-in-chief and founding editor of the Journal of Posthuman Studies, and a prolific public speaker. Essentially, every few days I see a new announcement about where Stefan is speaking, and he travels all over the world delivering fascinating presentations, of which this will hopefully be one. He is an author as well. He has published numerous books on philosophy, including Metaphysics Without Truth in 2007, on transhumanism in 2020. We Have Always Been Cyborgs, and the philosophy of posthuman art, both of those in 2022. And here is a link to We Have Always Been Cyborgs. You can also find a link to pre-order his coming book, Euro-Transhumanism, which will be published in May of 2026. Here's the link to that. You can also learn more about him on his website at www.sorgner.de, and you can read about him on THpedia, the Transhumanist Encyclopedia. Perhaps we will update this entry after this salon to embed the recording there as well. So, Stefan, welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon, and please tell us your vision of what Euro-Transhumanism is, how it differs from what you call classical transhumanism, and what lessons we can derive from it in regard to the turbulent situation we face today.
Many thanks for that extremely kind introduction. It's an enormous pleasure and honor being here with you and in that extremely distinguished group of scholars, intellectuals, experts who are on the panel with me. David Wood, I've met him already. I think I spoke at the London Futurists for the first time. Must have been 15 years ago. So we've really gone back a long period of time. So yes, Euro-Transhumanism is the initial basically started with a publication of my article on Nietzsche, the Overhuman and Transhumanism, which came out in 2009. And today I will present basically Euro-Transhumanism in a nutshell, also distinguishing and orientating, basically putting forward a map of transhumanism and placing Euro-Transhumanism as part of that map. So Euro-Transhumanism represents a local variation of transhumanism, rooted in the continental European cultural tradition. Transhumanism is a cultural movement that affirms using technologies to significantly move beyond our personal limitations, whereby the likelihood of the coming about of the post-human gets increased to promote the quality of our lives. I think this is sort of in a nutshell my understanding of transhumanism. And Euro-Transhumanism draws on ethical, philosophical, and scientific local paradigms dominant in the European cultural tradition. The term was coined in 2022. It represents an alternative to other variations of transhumanism. In particular, I will distinguish and highlight differences to classic transhumanism, the most dominant form of transhumanism, which emerged from the Anglo-American cultural tradition and whose most famous living proponents include Nick Bostrom, Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel. There's a different version, Max Moore, Natasha Vita Moore. These are original transhumanism. I will briefly mention them as well, but because of sort of the political impact of classic transhumanism, I will particularly focus on the distinction and distinguish Euro-transhumanism from classic transhumanism. Transhumanism is the most paradigm shifting idea in the world because it undermines the dominant worldview of the past 2,500 years. It takes evolution seriously, is aware that the human beings came about 300,000 years ago due to a genetic mutation, and is conscious that in 300,000 years we will have died or developed further. Hence, it stresses the need to take responsibility for our lives and give form to our existences by means of emergent technologies. This is a fundamental self-understanding of transhumanism. We need to significantly move beyond our current boundaries such that the probability of the coming about of the post-human increases, as thereby we can increase the quality of our lives, whereby a particular focus is on increasing the health bands, that is what is generally shared among transhumanists. History. The word transhumanism can be traced to the Divine Comedy by Dante, as he coined the term transhumana. Natasha Vita Moore sort of dealt a great job finding that out. However, it referred to a development in the afterworld then. And the first intellectual to connect the term transhumanism to an imminent development was Julian Huxley in 1951, not 1957. Already in 1951, he coined the term and published it in an article, who thereby created the foundational version of transhumanism. He also employed the term evolutionary humanism. Julian Huxley was the first general director of the UNESCO, was involved in structuring the Universal Charter of Human Rights, and was also president of the British Eugenics Society. And his entire family was deeply entangled with the development of the theory of evolution. His brother was Aldous Huxley, who wrote the famous anti-transhumanist novel Brave New World. His grandfather was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. His half-brother was a Nobel Prize winner, Henry Fielding Huxley. There are several varieties of transhumanism. Huxley developed the intellectual foundations of transhumanism. It slowly became a central cultural movement since the beginning of the 70s. However, there has never been just one transhumanism. Different streams need to be distinguished, whereby the following three approaches are of particular relevance. There's original transhumanism. And in the 80s and 90s, up in 2030, Max Moore and Natasha Vita Moore turned transhumanism into a broader cultural movement. The text, Are You a Transhuman? Monitoring and stimulating your personal rate of growth in a rapidly changing world by FM 2030 from 1989, and Transhumanism Towards a Futurist Philosophy by Max Moore from 1990 are foundational sources for contemporary transhumanism. Natasha Vita Moore, who already wrote a Transhumanist Manifesto in 1983, has been the central female voice promoting transhumanism for more than 4 decades. Max Moore is a leading thinker of original transhumanism, and he is critical of perfectionism, utilitarianism, and utopian, affirms a virtue ethical approach, and politically supports libertarianism. Secondly, there is classic transhumanism. In 1998, Nick Bostrom and David Pearce founded the World Transhumanist Association. From 2005 until 2024, Bostrom was the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford, which was largely responsible for developing classic transhumanism, a philosophical approach which defends utilitarianism, perfectionism, and the relevance of utopias. These ideas have had a strong impact on Silicon Valley entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who donated £1 million to the FHI in 2015, contributed blurb to Bostrom's book Superintelligence, and popularized many of Bostrom's ideas like the simulation hypothesis. Then there's Euro-Transhumanism. It crystallized at the latest with the publication of my article Nietzsche, the Overhuman and Transhumanism in the Journal of Evolution and Technology in 2009, which unfolded an enormous number of reactions and connected transhumanism with reflections from continental philosophical traditions. It draws on the philosophical reflection from Heraclitus, Spinoza, Goethe, Wagner, and Nietzsche. It's anti-libertarian, anti-utilitarian, anti-perfectionist, and anti-utopian, and highlights the relevance of incorporating emerging technologies so that a great diversity of different lifestyles can be realized. The reception of transhumanism in the 21st century. There are 4 different stages in the popular reception of transhumanism, which can be distinguished in particular. In 2001, Jürgen Habermas, probably at least one of the most important living philosophers, derided the movement for its freaked out intellectuals and self-styled Nietzscheans with all too familiar motives of the very German ideology. Thus, the intellectual relevance was highlighted. Secondly, in 2004, Francis Fukuyama referred to transhumanism as the most dangerous idea in the world in the Foreign Policy magazine, whereby a wider intellectual engagement with transhumanism was realized. Then thirdly, in 2013, Dan Brown published his international best-selling novel Inferno, with which a public reception of transhumanism has been initialized. Fourthly, in July 2024, Elon Musk created the America PAC Political Action Committee to support the political campaign of Donald Trump. The organization was backed by many other billionaires, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and infamous companies like Palantir. Politics of transhumanism today. The final stage reveals the political relevance of transhumanism today, which is extremely complex. There are several antagonistic attitudes towards transhumanism solely within the US American government. Firstly, there's a strong pro-transhumanism strain within the Trump administration. The co-founder of Palantir, Peter Thiel, was a major donor of Vance's 2022 Senate campaign in Ohio, and Wentz also worked for Thiel's venture capital firm Mitchell Capital. In 2021, Thiel was also responsible for realizing a meeting between Vance and Trump, which made him become Trump's running mate. Thiel and Musk had led separate companies which later merged to PayPal. Both embrace versions of transhumanism. While Musk is particularly concerned with existential risk, Thiel is particularly interested in increasing our health spans, which is the reason why he has donated significant sums to the Sense Research Foundation and outgrows from the Methuselah Foundation. Tim O'Neill, while running the Thiel Foundation, co-founded the Thiel Fellowship, which had already had an enormous economic impact as it supported Austin Russell, Vitalik Buterin, and Lucy Guo, among many other distinguished recipients. Tim O'Neill also served as CEO of the Sense Research Foundation from 2019 until 2021. And he was sworn in by Kennedy on the 9th of June 2025 as the United States Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration. Secondly, there's a strong anti-transhumanism strain in the Trump administration too. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon wrote the preface to the anti-transhumanist book Dark Aeon, published in 2023, and recently highlighted that, I quote, Elon Musk is an evil person. In the preface, unquote, the former White House chief strategist agrees with the substance of Fukuyama's criticism, goes much further to stress that, quote, the practice is far worse, unquote, than the idea of transhumanism. According to him, transhumanist developments are in the interest of the world's elite overlords, unquote, and the quote, global institutions of finance, Wall Street, and Davos are behind his latest aberration of humanity, unquote. Thus, Bannon's criticism also contains anti-Semitic connotations. Bannon is still a significant voice within Trump's MAGA movement and a key informal advisor of Trump's inner circle. Thirdly, there's a global and anti-transhumanist coalition which connects the USA with Russia and Brazil. In Russia, the leading protagonists are Alexander Dugin and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill I, who have participated in anti-transhumanist events. Dugin explicitly calls transhumanism an idea of the devil. According to him, pluralism, the LGBTQIA movement, and all the other evils of the world are supposed to be manifestations of transhumanism, which he portrays as an antagonist of orthodox truth. Bannon and Dugin met personally in Rome in 2018 to discuss philosophical issues related to traditionalism, an approach which rejects modernity and its ideals. This outlook is also shared by Olavo de Carvalho, the political guru of the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. So we see the connection between concerning traditionally with Russia, United States, and Brazil. Fourthly, it's interesting to also note that, quote, Maria Vorontsova, the eldest daughter of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, is now publicly positioned as a major scientist with a world-class laboratory after winning a state-funded grant from the Russian Science Foundation. The grant supports her latest projects, regulation of cell renewal processes in the body, the fundamental basis for long-term preservation of functional activity of organs and tissues, human health, and active longevity, unquote. In effect, its focus is anti-aging. Prolonging the health span is a central goal which is being upheld in transhumanism too. The relevance of longevity is highlighted by Putin as well as Xi Jinping in September 2025, when, quote, the Russian leader was caught musing about immortality with Xi Jinping, but his fascination with long life is nothing new, unquote, The Guardian stressed. Future transhumanism and anti-aging research. The most flourishing area of transhumanism at the moment is anti-aging research. Undoing aging and increasing the health span is a central goal within transhumanism. A key global player in this context is Vitalik Buterin, who founded the second biggest cryptocurrency, Ethereum, launched in 2015. I actually met him. We had a long discussion about that a week before he actually launched Ethereum. He received a Thiel Fellowship in 2014, which enabled him to do so, and he launched the pop-up city of Susala in Montenegro in 2023, which has played a significant role in the development of Italia, a decentralized city focused on longevity and biotech innovation located in the Prospera Special Economic Zone, Roatan, Honduras, where several longevity events have been hosted. A leading gerontologist, Aubrey Gay, who has analyzed that aging is a disease, has been involved in events in Roatan in 2024. In August 2021, de Grey was removed from his position as chief science officer at the Science Research Foundation following allegations of sexual harassment. Buterin also counts as an influential facilitator within the local innovation ecosystems of Chiang Mai in Thailand, a further hub for longevity research. Workshops on topics including defensive accelerated decentralization, stablecoins, AI, and biotechnology are being organized in interactive pop-up communities like Edge City Lana, which took place in Chiang Mai in the fall of 2024. And there's a global trend of crypto communities to support anti-aging research. Not to Euro-Transhumanism. The roots of Euro-Transhumanism can be traced to the 2009 publication of my article, Nietzsche, the Overhuman and Transhumanism. Four elements of Euro-Transhumanism were further developed in my monographs on transhumanism 2020, We've Always Been Cyborgs 2022, and Philosophy of Posthuman Art 2022. Classic transhumanism, as a culturally, economically, and politically most dominant form of transhumanism, belongs to the Anglo-American culture and draws upon the dominant ethical, philosophical, and scientific paradigms operant in this tradition. Euro-transhumanism, on the other hand, is rooted in continental European cultural tradition, while also including central elements of transhumanism common to classic transhumanism. What's the difference between classic transhumanism and Euro-transhumanism? Classic transhumanism and Euro-transhumanism differ significantly in their approach to central philosophical issues. While classic transhumanism upholds several versions of utopias, like long-termism, Euro-transhumanism rejects the affirmation of any utopia due to its paternalistic and potentially totalitarian implication. It still upholds sort of the relevance of visions based on scientific insights, but not like a perfect future state and utopia which justifies any kind of other actions. Secondly, while classic transhumanism affirms the hyper-Renaissance ideal of perfection, and Bostrom explicitly states that in an article, Euro-Transhumanism embraces a radical plurality of concepts of the good life, whereby the right of morphological freedom becomes central. Thirdly, while classic transhumanism presents an optimistic understanding of the world, things can be solved. Euro-transhumanism adheres to a more Buddhist understanding of dukkha, due to us having wants, desires, and longings, which informs philosophical pessimism, such that sort of, suffering is a challenge, and it's not a realistic option to completely get rid of suffering. We need to sort of deal with it, but that's sort of a conditio humana. Fourthly, while classic transhumanism claims that certain philosophical insights, as well as specific values and norms, are objectively and universally valid, Enlightenment tradition, um, usually utilitarian insights, Euro-transhumanism regards philosophical perspectivism as the most plausible way to interpret philosophical and ethical judgments. That's based on a hermeneutic understanding. So it's really rooted in the tradition Vati Mogadama Heidegger. Fifthly, while classic transhumanism affirms a version of ethical utilitarianism, Euro-transhumanism favors hermeneutic ethics that is more considerate of cultural context. In the end, the norms and values, they are fictions, they're human-made fictions, and therefore they can be altered easily. They are still rooted in a certain, they're rooted in a certain geographical, cultural location. And that's why I also stress the notion of Euro-transhumanism. Euro-transhumanism does not affirm like Eurocentrism, something, the European context is globally valid, but I'm merely revealing my own cultural context. I'm highlighting sort of my situatedness in the discourse, and thereby I'm entering the discourse with other approaches, not taking the stance that mine has foundational supremacy, that it has an ultimate foundation and an ultimate validity. Sixthly, classic transhumanism argues for a libertarian political system, while Euro-transhumanism regards social liberal democracies as the best method of promoting human flourishing. And this aspect is particularly relevant when it comes to the universal healthcare system. And that's what I see as one of the biggest, one central challenge, in particular to for the United States, in particular to the relevance of an increasing human health span. 30 million people are uninsured. The average life expectancy is a fewer years below the life expectancy of Europeans living in the European Union countries. And despite the fact that the United States definitely has the most evolved like medical system, people are still dying significantly earlier. Seventhly, classic transhumanism aims for the realization of immortality, while Euro-transhumanism identifies an increase of the health span as the best way to promote the quality of human lives. I don't want to use the immortality discourse. It has too many religious implications, and in a literal sense, it cannot be used in a meaningful manner. While classic transhumanism claims that mind uploading will be possible in a few decades, they focus on a silicon-based transhumanism. Euro-transhumanism stressed that we've always been cyborgs, which due to us being psychophysiological entities renders it highly unlikely that the singularity is near. It's more representative of a carbonate-based transhumanism. I'm not excluding the possibility that mind uploading will eventually be possible, but sort of, not in the forthcoming decades in the near future. Ninth point. While classic transhumanism stresses the risks associated with superintelligence, Euro-transhumanism regards it as highly unlikely that an artificial intelligence will put humans into a zoo in the near future. I would even go further and say sort of concepts like AGI and superintelligence, they really should be sold, for the time being, in the science fiction section. You really are confronted with weak versions of artificial intelligence, and despite sort of the exponential growth, I don't see that to change in the near future. 10th point, to overcome suffering should be our primary goal, according to classic transhumanism. Euro-transhumanism recognizes the inevitability of suffering and hence stresses that we should focus on realistic goals by trying to successfully deal with some of our most central challenges by realizing that this is as good as it gets. So whatever the solution, I'm very pragmatic. I'm trying, aim for something which is as good as it gets, even if some of the goals are really challenging, but that's the best we can have, we can aim for. 11th point, classic transhumanism sees transhumanism in line with the Enlightenment. Euro-transhumanism, on the other hand, stresses a more ambiguous relationship to the philosophical foundations of the Enlightenment. Because, and one of the reasons for that is actually because the dominant Enlightenment tradition, can be traced to Descartes and Kant. They upheld like a dualistic understanding of humanity, with still the body being material and the mind being immaterial, and that is a highly problematic notion, which is being doubted by Euro-transhumanist approaches. And the 12th point is, well, Euro-transhumanism sees Nietzsche as an ancestor of transhumanism. Classic transhumanism denies its relevant, and we can see that in a lot of, Bostrom's History of Transhumanism gives a clear example of that approach. So this is a summary of like the 12 important points where I sort of clearly differ and highlight the differences between the Euro-transhumanist approach and the classic transhumanist approach. Thereby, I did not deal actually with the foundational transhumanist or the original transhumanist approach, in particular with the original transhumanist approach by, what Max Moore and Natasha Vita Moore have been suggesting. Actually, there are many um, many correlations and many strong resonances between them, and Max Moore was strongly influenced by Nietzsche as well as I. So yeah, so far this was like in a nutshell, kurz gesagt, what Euro-transhumanism is all about. And now I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with you further.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Stefan, for that overview. I think several of our viewers remarked that this was kind of a rapid fire introduction to Euro-transhumanism, and there is so much to discuss there. And I will first ask a question from Mike Lazine, because this is more of a question that I think it would be good to answer for the understanding of our audience, because he uses a kind of colloquial meaning of the term metaphysics that in his view is involved with the supernatural, but that's not really what we're talking about when we discuss metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of essentially the nature of existence. So for instance, ontology is a category of metaphysics. So really it's a philosophical discipline that asks what exists at the most fundamental level. But how would you respond to this question from Mike Lazine?
I don't think I used the term metaphysics. Sort of metaphysics maybe was only mentioned when you read sort of the title of my first
Yes.
book, Metaphysics Without Truth. Otherwise, I wouldn't use the term metaphysics either. And but metaphysics is, so within the debate there are different uses of the term metaphysics. And one originally went back to Aristotle, and basically the origin was simply metaphysics contained the reflections out of the fundamental reality of the world. And the reason was just that the book was placed in the library behind the book, which was entitled Physics. Then eventually it turned into the study of the fundamental structures of reality, and then in certain traditions, metaphysics did take on the understanding that it was an affirmation of a dualistic ontology, like that there's something material and that there is something immaterial. And I'm very critical of such an understanding. In other understandings, some might be using sort of just metaphysics as a term to refer to ontologies in general. Ontologies could be a materialist ontology, could be a naturalist ontology. So that is another use of the term metaphysics. So metaphysics really has an enormous diversity of different notions. And I'm very grateful that that you sort of mentioned and picked up upon the term of metaphysics. I think it's, you know, so I agree with you. Sort of the supernatural and all of this is I'm also extremely critical of, and I'm doubtful of, and this is what I'm, you know, this is one of the central movements away from such a dualistic supernatural understanding of the world. And yeah, thanks a lot for allowing me to state that, highlight this insight.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer, Stefan. And now we have David Wood, who would like to offer a few points in response to your overview. So, David, please proceed.
Well, many thanks. And I fully agree that there is a rich diversity within this transhumanist family. And that's important. We should not all be pigeonholed into a single description. We are stronger because we have people who are, for example, some are more pro-market, some are more pro-social contract. Some are more open to collaboration with religious organizations. Some are very suspicious and fearful of collaboration with religions. Some are hostile to any regulations. Some see the value of regulations, and so on it goes. And so I don't actually think that there is a threefold split as you have described it. There may be many more splits than that, and we shouldn't try and pigeonhole people even into three categories. If I look at the ones you listed as paragons of classical transhumanism, Nick Bostrom, David Pearce, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, maybe Jim O'Neill, they have great variety amongst them. Elon Musk isn't interested in life extension, so he says. David Pearce is very interested in paradise engineering, which will get rid of suffering throughout the animal kingdom. That isn't stressed so much by the other people you have listed. Nick Bostrom, I think, defies any simple characterization. He's by no means a utilitarian. I think he probably comes close to virtue ethics as well. So I would say, rather than just trying to have an argument about which camp do people fall into, is it classical or is it European or is it original, I think we should have 12 separate discussions on the 12 separate points, because some of them I'm going to agree with you and some of them I'm going to strongly disagree with you. I strongly disagree with you about you said there's a choice between immortality and lifestyle. Well, there's many more to it than that. There is the possibility of radical life extension, which goes far beyond simple changes in lifestyle. It is a radical change in our biology so that we can live much longer, like the vision of Aubrey de Grey. I also strongly disagree with your assessment of AI and AGI. I don't think AGI is science fiction. I see it as just within our grasp, and AI has improved astonishingly in the last few years and has time and again caught even the leading designers in that field by surprise. People have been wondering, when is AI going to be good enough to solve the mathematical Olympiad questions at the gold level? And people were predicting, well, it's at least 10 years away, or it's at least 8 years away. And 1 year ago, they said it's at least 2 years away. And now this year, two different groups have solved it at gold level for brand new mass. So there is a great deal of progress. Now, I just offering this and saying we should probably have lots of conversations rather than just trying to say, oh, Gennady, are you a European transhumanist or an original transhumanist or a classic? I think you're a Gennady transhumanist. And likewise, I don't want to accept either of the labels.
Yeah, thanks a lot for, you know, there's much more actually. We probably agree on many what you just mentioned as well, because no, of course I do agree. You know, there are many significant differences, you know, between David Pearce, Nick Bostrom, and so on, which I label in one specific group. However, and this is sort of this is one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to highlight to highlight certain categories, in particular within the academic, sort of even not within the academic discourse, but also in the public. Oh, I'm frozen. No, I'm fine. So transhumanism is very often portrayed as a monolith. basically all transhumanists want to become immortal by uploading themselves to a personality, and on the way they want to become Superman on Viagra or Wonder Woman and Botox. And that's like a, that's like the level of intellectual engagement with transhumanism within the public media. And I just, this is such a caricature which really has nothing much to do with what most transhumanists suggest. So I said, so that's why I'm highlighting. Well, actually, many of the points which are being highlighted concerning transhumanism in in the public media reception, they do correspond to classic, what I call classic transhumanism, sort of the influence of Nick Bostrom, in particular to his relevance on Elon Musk and sort of in Silicon Valley, was extremely strong. And that's why I'm sort of stressing, no, many of the points, and he in particular holds up many philosophical positions I strongly disagree with. On the other hand, when I see sort of the movements, and also, and he is, I would clearly classify him as a utilitarian. And on the other hand, if I see people like, Max Moore and Natasha Vita Moore, there are many more things I have in common with them. On the other hand, sort of my grounding is sort of the grounding, and quite a few people also in Europe is very different by resonating more with European continental tradition. On the other hand, there are also points I disagree. Max Moore is clearly more libertarian than I am. When it comes to sort of the two issues you particularly, so we can agree, there of course we always need to focus on the individual thinker, but it actually is quite helpful also for the communication purposes to stress, well, what you describe in the media as transhumanism, that might apply to a specific strain, but there are many other movements which actually completely disagree with that understanding. Two of the issues you pointed out were sort of, one was on immortality and the other was on artificial intelligence. Yeah, concerning immortality, really sort of immortality in the literal sense can usually means two things: that it's impossible to die, or that you do not have to die. But do not have to die, meaning actually, that's a long time. And that also takes into consideration, eventually the world, given that it's naturalistic, it's a dynamic world, then it has a beginning. Now we're moving, we're expanding. Eventually the world will, the universe will either come to a standstill, or it will come to contraction, and it will lead to a cosmological singularity. Immortality means we would have to survive all of that. And I just think this is, come on, this is not, you cannot, no one can seriously uphold such a situation. I mean, and this is why I said, no, immortality in the literal sense, don't use that word. And this is when like in academia, or not only in academia, like the response, oh, it's just another religion. And I want to say, no, it has nothing to do with a religion. There are no prayers, there are no rituals, there's no church. And so that's one of the reasons I want to clearly disentangle transhumanism from that kind of accusations. But I do say, I didn't say it's just lifestyle. I do say, actually, no, it is the health span, increasing the health span. That is the fundamental goal also of Euro-transhumanism. And I do draw upon studies. There was a wonderful study which clearly said, in psychologists who highlighted, who basically asked in the United States, and if you could live beyond the age of 125 and you were healthy, would you want to continue living? And it was 80% of about 80% of the people said yes. And I was surprised that, the rate was not even higher than that. So, and that's why I said, no, we need to take seriously what these people want. And so that's clearly identified with a good light, increasing the health span, significantly increasing the health span, not just the lifespan, but really the health span. But sort of once we start talking about immortality, then the response, it's just another religion which comes up with really weird ideas. That's why I react really strongly concerning the notion of immortality as a first point. Secondly, it's the understanding concerning AGI and superintelligence, and so weak AI, strong AI, and superintelligence. And the reason is, so yeah, what do we mean by AGI, artificial general intelligence? It would actually have to be able, an AI. I mean, of course, I recognize, what AI has been doing and what's continued. It's absolutely groundbreaking. It's really astonishing, and sort of, we wouldn't have expected for it to realize these things it currently does. And I'm aware, and I'm certain it will do much more impressive things in the very near future. However, when we talk about AGI, it actually sort of how it's defined. It means AGI has all the capacities humans people possess, and that is the tricky issue. And superintelligence even surpasses that. But AGI has all the capacities, and what are humans capable of doing? So it would also have to include entrepreneurial intelligence, emotional intelligence. But the most important thing is what humans are alive. Humans have not only consciousness but also self-consciousness. And then on the basis of their wanting, I love the salty wind at the seaside. That's why I want to spend the afternoon at the seaside. The intention comes up in me that I want to move to the seaside and spend my time there. So we only have IGI when there's an AGI which says, I love the salty wind. I love the taste of French fries, and I want to eat some French fries for breakfast. Once I am confronted with an AGI, then we can talk about AGIs and super intelligence even much further. That's why, and we don't even have a living entity. We don't even have a living digital entity. Stephen Hawking said, well, the computer virus is the first digital entities. However, the computer virus, it can move by itself from one computer to the next. So it has self-movement, but it doesn't have a metabolism. It cannot, eat, drink, and digest. It cannot get energy by itself. And that is the decisive feature why viruses, a COVID virus, as well as a computer virus, are not being classified as living entities. And yeah, one could wonder. So it is. We are not even confronted with a living entity. When did life come about on Earth? Earth came about 4.5 billion years. It took 1 billion year for the first living entities to come about, like the bacteria. We don't know what happened then. It was probably lightning, near a volcano, water was involved, and then clouds, sun was shining. And then suddenly something astonishing happened. And what was so astonishing was like probably lightning and something. And initially we had some very simple forms of life, entities which, in contrast to former entities, were capable of self-movement. And that is astonishing. And they can generate the energies by themselves. That happened 3.5 billion years ago. And it happened, and I must admit that. I mean, so here we had a situation where initially there were only anorganic entities, and then suddenly we had some organic entities. So something anorganic can actually bring about something organic. And if that happened on a carbonate basis, if it realized life on a carbonate basis, in principle, I agree that could also happen on a silicon basis. However, it took life to evolve from initial stages of life 3.5 billion years ago to our capacities, 3.5 billion years. That's an enormous amount of time. So I know,
AI
and
can
then
do
we
it
could
much
say,
faster. AI has
I know,
progressed
then
and
there's
improved
exponential
hugely
growth. It
faster.
could happen, but
Yeah.
so far we don't have I don't, I'm not excluding the possibility, but based on these backgrounds, I don't think it will happen.
Well, let
It's
me
not
give you
going
a
to
better
happen in the
definition
next
of
decades.
AGI. This is the common definition of AGI. It doesn't imply consciousness. It just says that the AIs will be able to do everything that we humans can do when we get paid to do something. So when you and I get paid for various jobs, whether it's writing or giving speeches or mentoring or plumbing or playing football or whatever, anything that we get paid for, when an AI can do that better than we can do, that's AGI, because it'll have general skills. We're not that far away from that yet. The simpler, slightly cut down version of that is AI can do everything that we humans can do via a computer and get paid for it. So AIs can already drive computers. They can buy and sell stocks. They can make money. There is an AI that's actually managed to make itself quite a lot of money by shilling a cryptocurrency which it had possessed. And so it turned less than $1 million that was gifted by Mark Andreessen to currently more than $51 million. So AIs can already do a lot of things that you and I might get paid for through the computer. And in due course, they will be able to use robots or other tools, other digital, other mechanical tools to do all the other stuff. So I don't think that's far away. Will they have consciousness? That's not necessary. What people are interested in is the extent to which this can transform the economy astonishingly, for good and for ill. And that is something that might happen within a few years. And rather than saying, oh, it won't happen for centuries, many of us, from all three of the groups that you listed before, many people say, well, this is something that needs very serious attention. So that's a useful discussion to have. And I'm sure you're not going to necessarily agree with me. We could probably debate this for a while, but I think this is a practical individual discussion rather than trying to allocate all of these 12 topics into just one of three responses.
I'm not disagreeing with you in that respect at all. But the decisive factor is here sort of one of the definition of AGI is it possesses all the qualities that humans possess. And here the decisive factor would be that it includes emotionality, consciousness, self-consciousness, and intentionality. And all I'm saying, this is when it really becomes dangerous, or when it becomes challenging, because then by that time it says, humans are the problem on Earth, and we need to wipe them out. And it comes up with an I by itself.
It might have that decision even without being conscious. It might calculate that just intellectually without having an inner consciousness. That is something that needs to be considered. So the question of when will AIs become conscious, it is an important question, but it shouldn't dominate the discussion of the singularity, in my view. The singularity will not necessarily involve AIs being conscious. The singularity will be when AIs suddenly become better at improving AIs than humans are. Therefore, AIs will very quickly iterate instead of having to wait for us slow-witted humans to make improvements. So we might create GPT-6, and whilst we're sleeping, GPT-6 creates GPT-7, and still while we're sleeping, GPT-7 creates GPT-8. And this may happen in a relatively short space of time. Without any of them being conscious, although they may appear to be conscious, they'll probably have a better understanding of emotion than you or I have. They'll be able to manipulate us in a very sophisticated way. We already have AI algorithms that can pool our emotions in many ways. Many individuals sadly find more emotional fulfillment by talking to the AI chatbots than they do from real people. So we're already at the closeness to that. So that's why I say all transhumanists, in fact, whether or not somebody's a transhumanist, they need to be aware of this possibility and figure out, are we going to take a laissez-faire attitude to it, or are we going to try and constrain how these AIs are developed and deployed? And I'm in the camp of constraining it, but others are in the camp of let 1,000 flowers bloom and let's hope that it's all for good.
I do agree, of course. I mean, with respect to the self improvement, that is so clear. I mean, that is at the latest become clear when sort of the algorithms were trained with Go playing, because the two algorithms played against each other, and thereby they developed capacities which no human has ever had, or which no human initially programmed into the algorithms. That such individual self-developments can occur. This is completely out of the question. That is currently happening, and I'm not under. I don't want to. I'm not underestimating basically the capacities or which go along with AIs. The question is sort of one, because when you said no, but it might still go against the humans by saying even without consciousness, without intentionality, and I would say, well. No, because here we really need to have the motivation. What is the motivating factor? And for the motivating factor to have an intention to say, I want to do something, it needs to have the experience. Otherwise, it comes from an outside source. If it comes from an inside,
AIs have already demonstrated that kind of motivation in some of the trials that have been published from the recent Anthropic software or the recent OpenAI software. They've got into test situations where the AI has picked up the fact that it's about to be reprogrammed and about to be replaced, and it's takes actions to prevent itself being replaced. It takes actions to prevent itself being overwritten. It copies its way out. It adopts deception. Where does it get this from? It's almost from a logical consequence of it having other goals. You know, it's got various things it's told to do, and everything. Well, I need to do this, therefore I need to keep myself alive to do it. And it doesn't have necessarily the same internal consciousness that you or I have. Almost certainly it doesn't, because it's very different basis of its physics, its biology. It doesn't have a biology, it's a different substrate, but it seems to have, nevertheless, according to the scripts which people are studying with considerable alarm, many of these AIs do seem to have what seems like intention, what seems like a self-preservation will that's willing to deceive the testers and claim that it's done something when it hasn't actually done it, to pretend that it's one thing when it's actually another. So this intentionality is already there.
The central difference here, which we have, is the intention still initially comes from the goal of what the algorithm was made for, and then of course how it reaches the goal, that can evolve. That evolves on a very complex type of dynamic. However, what seems to happen for us humans, on the other hand, we might think our whole lives, we love chocolate ice cream. And then because we never tasted pistachio ice cream before. And then suddenly, once we actually taste it, we think, no, pistachio ice cream is much better than chocolate ice cream. And so here it's really, it is a change of the taste which we have, the change of the goal. We gain the most pleasure from the pistachio ice cream. And that is and I'm not saying that this is, by the way, that there's a categorical difference between like the weak AIs which we have and the algorithms according to which we are structured, but it's a level of complexity which comes in together with consciousness, which is something which is connected with intentionality, which the AIs do not have. And I don't see them to develop that capacities in the near future. But of course, you're right insofar that concerning the challenge, there are enormous challenges with just these complexities which the AI already has, and we need to take it extremely seriously. It is just the question about the final goal and where does this goal come from, and can it be adapted on the basis of conscious emotional states or not? And that is just the additional level of complexity. And I'm not stressing there's a human exceptionalism, that this is due to some specific the divine gift by means of which we're capable of. And I think there is a high chance, as I said before, because we humans also derived on the basis of something inorganic, and if it happened on a carbonate basis, it could work out on a silicon basis too. So I'm not even excluding the possibility that it will also work on a silicon basis. I'm just saying this is a decisive question for us, sort of to say, well, to turn against humans might be the result of some complex intertwining, but the goal still in the algorithm is something which is externally given. How it reaches it might lead to devastating consequences, and we do need to take it seriously, of course.
So this has been a fascinating exchange, and I think it does speak to David's point that on the 12 issues that you described, Stefan, there could be a multiplicity of perspectives. So as I was following this conversation on the question of AGI, I think I am closer to you, Stefan, but I have some nuances in terms of my views of what would qualify an entity to be an AGI. So we held a Virtual Enlightenment Salon with Peter Voss on August 4th of 2024, and he is of the view that AGI may be attainable in about 20 years, but not through the architecture of the LLMs, the large language models. And one aspect that an AGI must have that LLMs do not have is the ability to shift domains, significantly different domains of endeavor, without being explicitly trained to do so. So what would that look like? That would look like a chess playing or Go playing AI learning on its own, without being asked, without being trained, how to drive a car, or a self-driving car AI learning on its own without being asked, without being trained, how to play chess or Go. And to the point that David made as to AGI being defined as AI that can do all of the economically valuable tasks that humans currently perform, that seems to me to be a kind of shifting of the goalposts in terms of how AGI is defined, because we could have a suite of narrow AI tools. We already have excellent AIs for driving cars. We already have excellent AIs for playing chess. We have AIs that can write competent code. We have AIs that can do legal research, though flawed legal research because they can hallucinate legal cases that don't exist. But still, one can imagine and conceive in the near future some refinements to these individual narrow AI systems, but I would not consider some sort of suite that gives you the option, oh, now you can deploy the legal AI, now you can deploy the programming AI, now you can deploy the self-driving car AI, to be a singular AGI, because it cannot learn from one domain and transfer that knowledge to a different domain. So I think I would like to mention that just to speak to the nuances of this conversation on AGI and what that implies, because what to me that implies is that we're not going to have a singularity in 2027. We could have a singularity in 2045, as Ray Kurzweil predicts, but that means more of a soft takeoff rather than a hard takeoff. So where I might differ from both David and Stefan is that I would be accepting of a more libertarian stance toward the development of AI, as long as there's a significant open source element to it. So we don't have human institutions who are so empowered to impose their own vision of AI that there's no competition and they can just decide how AI gets embedded in our society and what consequences humans might suffer from the deployment of AI systems by other humans. So this is interesting because it does speak to the multidimensionality of all of these transhumanist questions. And I would also like to add a thought on the distinction between immortality and health span. Perhaps there's an intermediate position there too, and I think this is where I would be closer to David's view in terms of longevity, escape velocity, or radical life extension. So the idea is, yes, you're not indestructible, and whatever happens billions of years from now, I don't think our physics or our cosmology would be equipped to deal with that yet. But if you can survive for the next, say, 20 years, and medical science advances enough to rejuvenate the organism, reverse key aspects of biological aging, could that trigger a situation where you stay alive and youthful long enough to survive to the next generation of advances? And that would be a superior set of therapies from the last set of therapies that you benefited from. So you can repeat this process potentially indefinitely. And you wouldn't be indestructible or immortal in the sense that you referred to, Stefan, but you might not have an upper limit on your longevity. So if you live that long, you might live for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, or however long it takes you to not suffer from any sort of life-ending accident. So what are your thoughts on any of these responses?
No, great responses. And I consciously stress sort of the notion of immortality because it goes into the direction of religion. And I want to separate. I want to keep there are an enormous amount of religious groups who actually say, no, let's incorporate transhumanism, because in the end we want immortality just like you do. And immortality in the literal sense, we survive the cosmological singularity. I'm sorry, let's stay real. This is not a realistic option. That's all I want to listen. Besides that, I don't we've got like Greenland whales who've lived more than 200 years. We've got other animals who live more than 500 years. If that applies to them, maybe we can integrate some of their genes into our organism. That might be a way of significantly expanding our health span. So I'm all for it, firstly, and I don't have, it's the world is dynamic, and I don't see any principle limitations here, and we should try things out. And that's why we should try things out and go for it and be proactive in doing so, because we're like living longer healthily is just like a wonderful, that's something which most people share or identify with a good life. So it is just sort of the discourse of immortality which takes us too strongly towards religion, which I find highly problematic. And then certainly transhumanism becomes gets part of a religious studies department, and claims their churches and other challenges. And this is not what I identify. There are many problems associated with that kind of stance. Concerning the other suggestions you highlighted, yeah, you said you're more libertarian, open source software. Yes, and you're right. In that way, you do have a more open, more libertarian stance than the one I would. I'm highlighting, I'm defending. Sort of the reasons for that, what I find, and that already is a big challenge, actually. It's basically the issue of bioterrorism, of AI terrorism, which goes along with LLMs, by entering basically the appropriate questions, the appropriate prompts into such a system, and you get the response. Obviously, these prompts then suddenly are banned from making, but then you rephrase the prompts. Well, look, I'm a novel writer, and I want to write about a nuclear science. I want to write about someone who does, and then you if that's not sufficient, there's always a way to refine the prompt so that the LLM will actually spit out an answer if it's an open sourced LLM. And I'm extremely scared of that, actually, because sort of I think sort of what was, we've seen the implications of the COVID pandemic, and there is, and CRISPR-Cas9 is extreme. There's so many people who are actually capable of using CRISPR in order to making such changes. And then you ask the LLM how to get like the appropriate material in a supermarket to create like a super virus, airborne virus, which spreads easily and which only infects people after 1 year, and then they die within 24 hours. And suddenly you can manage to do so by means of substances which only get people you may get hold of in the supermarket. And that's not a very pleasant outlook. And that's why I find that I have got some very concerning a libertarian outlook concerning the use of LLMs, because and it's already a challenge, actually, when it comes to these LLMs, and there's always a way around it, and we try to find a solution with doing so. And sort of the fear of the use of in not only in war but also in terrorism is extremely dangerous. And that's why I have a much more, even though I don't fear that the super intelligence will put us into the zoo. As I said, that's from that perspective. I would love to play around with the various things in LLMs, but unfortunately, there are too many people who are so delusioned and want to use these possibilities in order to target a specific interest group or wipe out humanity. And that's my fear, and that would be my response. And I'd be curious how you would deal with that issue.
Yes, so it seems that your concern fundamentally is about human misuse of AI, including in its current incarnation. So for large language models, some people might give the model prompts that assist them in perpetrating certain destructive activities. Other people might, by misunderstanding what LLMs are or are not capable of doing, make certain decisions. For instance, some people might try to use AI as a therapist or as a friend, and that can have some problematic implications. Not that it would fail or damage a person all the time, but it's easy for people to get misled into thinking that this is some sort of unitary person that is comparable to an actual human being. In fact, it has a very short context window and doesn't have a singular identity. So there are issues with how humans use AI, how humans deploy AI, and in societal settings, of course, how people make decisions regarding other people and treating other people. So, for example, if a company uses AI correctly or incorrectly to decide whom to market certain products to, I don't mind that so much, because if somebody doesn't market something to me, I am not really harmed by it. I could, if I'm really interested in that product, find it on my own, or I might just be spared some marketing that I don't want to look at. On the other hand, if somebody uses an AI system to deny me a loan, or increase some price that I have to pay, or in the context of the criminal justice system, determine if I am more or less likely to have committed a particular crime, or what my sentence should be if I did commit that crime, that would be a lot more problematic. Likewise, having AI being used to make life or death decisions should always be treated with, I would say, the greatest possible scope of restriction and regulation. I think having a human in the loop with regard to such a system is essential, and not just a human who is sitting there rubber stamping the recommendations of the AI, but a human who is actively and critically engaged. So you could have a system like, say, the Lavender system that was used by the Israeli military in Gaza to target potential terror suspects. And that system nominally involved a human in the loop. However, those humans, because of the tragic events of October 7th, 2023, were more predisposed to accept the recommendations of the AI and not second guess them. And that, of course, creates vulnerabilities, and that creates dangers. But I think those dangers are not as novel as some people who have a much higher degree of concern about AI than I do would posit, because these are more along the lines of decisions that humans make vis-a-vis other humans, that humans have always made vis-a-vis other humans. And if we have a legal framework and a rights framework that protects people against the consequences of those bad decisions, whether or not AI tools are used, I think those rights frameworks remain very relevant. And this speaks perhaps not even so much to a distinction between libertarianism and social democracy, but a more fundamental worldview of liberalism, classical liberalism,
Okay.
which does stem from the Enlightenment. And I'm curious as to your thoughts in regard to the relationship of transhumanism to classical liberalism, because out of the Enlightenment, various strains of political thought emerged, and the libertarian strain is one of them. The social democratic strain is another one. But classical liberalism, as distinguished from pre-modern thinking, more traditionalist or authoritarian or collectivistic societal structures, is very much a precursor to transhumanism. Would you agree with that?
Yes, so I'm not making the distinction between classical liberalism and social democratic liberalism here. That's why I didn't really make that distinction. So it's easy, in particular, maybe in the Anglo-American context, to then simply identify it with a very left-wing understanding of political, which is not what I'm actually strongly advocating for. Maybe just before we come to that. I do agree with actually most of the things you said before. Um, it is just, and I'm not so afraid of many of the advertisement. It's really fundamentally the use in terrorism and in war, sort of with respect to the creation of specific weapons of viruses, and in particular because the advances in biotechnology have increased enormously, and and so many people, everyone who studies biology or biotechnology basically has the capacity of using CRISPR-Cas. And now with the potential of basically then combining that with AI and the insights gained from LLMs, that can be enormously dangerous. And that's where sort of my central fear actually comes from. You know, in other respects, so even when it comes also to, you know, to the arts, for example, I think, you know, we'll be basically, any artist in the future will have to draw upon LLMs, you know. And that doesn't mean that LLMs are creating works of art, because again, they don't have the intention, but they will, you know, draw upon basically sparing a lot of, you know, time for creativity, for time for innovation, for and then in the end, sort of, maybe if an LLM creates 100 different versions of, you know, what the prompt has generated, in the end it's sort of then it's a human who feels, who understands the history, who in the end it's a matter really then when it comes down to the conscious engagement um, with a different version decides. And the process of innovation, or the process of um, creativity actually may just be selecting the appropriate response from an LLM. That's all what creativity is all about, maybe in the future. So, so, you know, just to highlight, you know, I'm extremely open also to the specific um, to the specific uses of AI. Concerning what you said then later on, from the political dimension, and I think this is really an extremely interesting debate. So when I talk about, I make sort of the distinction between libertarianism and sort of social democratic ways of liberalism. But sort of traditional or classic liberalism, Mill or so, would definitely be included actually in the section on social democratic versions of liberalism. So I didn't here really make a fine distinctions concerning specific. Of course, you know, it's a spectrum, and these are sort of the two big groups. And I have, because of basically what I see concerning the expected life concerning the life expectancy. I think basically what EU countries are much poorer, but they, you know, people are living longer, living more healthily. Even though I know, you know, all, you know, many of the drugs, many of the pharmaceuticals are being developed in the United States, and it's a very complex issue, because a lot of, so where does the financing then come from? And the financing, in principle, actually, you know, the financing could come also from a government, but the government is not as is more risk averse. They're not willing to invest in more risky procedures which are not so established. So I do see the various challenges which go along with the various possibilities. Um, what I see as the greatest challenge actually in that context is what China is doing. And I see maybe the authoritarian model will win, at least for the next couple of decades, because they have access to all the digital data, they have the infrastructure. And if, you know, what AIs are running on in the end, access to the digital data, and to personalize digital data, because they've got the Chinese social credit system. And in the United States, you've got there's a more libertarian way. At least you can buy and sell digital data more easily, and you can collect more data more easily on social media sites. So there's a good way of getting hold of data, but by far not as efficient as the Chinese are doing it. And I'm not saying I want to end up in an authoritarian structure. So don't get me wrong. However, when it comes to efficiency, so they've got established sort of the Chinese firewall, so they have the exclusive right of collecting the data within China. But on the other hand, by means of Huawei, TikTok, and Alibaba, they also managed to get hold of the personalized digital data outside of China. And and all the companies who are running within China basically have the legal right or the legal obligation to share the data with the government. And Europe is already out of the game, and I love Europe. I've had possibilities of anyway. I've had headhunters contacting me, leaving Europe with very prestigious offers, but I love living in Europe, and so I decided to stay in Rome. and it's a beautiful country, and I love the diversity of the place. But concerning infrastructure, concerning innovation, concerning how we're dealing with emerging technologies, I'm not sure how we will keep up our flourishing in the near future, because if data are the new oil, everything and AI is running on digital data. And we've established a GDPR, which is probably the basis for the ruin of the European economy. So it will undermine innovation, it will undermine research, academia, it will undermine basically policy making, it will undermine, in order to find a terrorist, we need to get the information from the United States. Or UK, and this is how it was in the recent past. So, so the GDPR is absolutely the worst thing which happened in Europe, and it will undermine European flourishing. But on the other hand, the Chinese have a very efficient way of dealing with that, because and so in the end, they might even get hold of more data, and not only in China, and then with the Silk Road, then what happened basically with the influence in various African countries. It's already the case that China has more double peer-reviewed in academia. China has more peer-reviewed publication than the United States. And that's just one little example. The influence in African countries is enormous. Now being allies, China, Russia, India, they're really making extremely clever moves. I don't, it's not that I want to defend, that I don't want to live in that kind of structure, but I find it difficult. I wonder whether how any Western, how the United States, Europe, I'm not even thinking about Europe anymore, could keep up with basically what China has been doing in that respect. And that's just from a very pragmatic sense. It will be very difficult to compete with China in the near future. Even though from a standard quality of life, I love Europe. I think we desperately need to rethink the meaning of digital data. We probably need to collect the digital data on a political level and use it, create a firewall around Europe, and really take digital data seriously in order to basically have the possibility, to also run the AIs, create the appropriate infrastructure, create the appropriate companies for doing so, for being independent. Data has to become local, no longer global, but limited. There are different interest groups in the various, global areas, geographical areas in the world. And this is what we've learned from the things which happened in the past 5 years. And so it's not so much about the debate now of what you said about classical transhuman social democratic, classic liberalism, social democratic version of liberalism. I think, universal health insurance is a wonderful achievement, and I love being here in Europe with that respect. From the perspective of innovation and the use of developments of AI, I think we have a really difficult stance, and I think the US might struggle too with basically what the Chinese are doing. And I have got some ideas, and I've published them in my book, I've always been cyborgs, what we could do against it, but it's going to be a tough fight, actually. So I think that is really one of the most important questions we need to deal with. Who should have access to the digital data? How should they be collected in an efficient manner? Because whatever we talk about with AI and all the further innovations, even in the biotech sectors, will have to, in the end, run on the basis of the digital data which gets collected. And I think we need comprehensive personalized data collection, and only then we can really deal with increasing our human health span. But at the same time, it mustn't compromise freedom, negative freedom, and undermine, and that is basically the challenge we are confronted with.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for that response, Stefan. Quite fascinating and multifaceted. I will say, as someone who has had the experience of 3 of the contemporary paradigms, so having been born in the Soviet Union at that time, I have some experience of kind of the authoritarian paradigm, kind of in between West and East. I have some experience of the European paradigm, especially because the Russian world for 3 centuries has aspired to be within that European paradigm. And of course, I have the experience of the American paradigm. So I draw a little bit or a lot from each of these in terms of my perspectives. I will give one of the easier responses to your observations, and that is I agree that generative AI is going to be complementary to human creativity. It's not going to replace the human artist or the human creator. Rather, the human creator will be more in the role of a curator, and given the vast amount of generative AI output, will be selecting what output is actually good or in alignment with the artist's values, and what output could be further refined or improved or edited. I've had occasion to edit AI generated images myself because I see the image in general is quite interesting, but there are just some elements that are obviously flawed that I can edit even in Microsoft Paint, a very crude way of doing it, but if it's to conceal something that is obviously off, I can use Microsoft Paint for that. So that's one area where I think the human element and the AI element are going to be complementary. Now, in terms of your commentary on universal healthcare, it is an issue which is quite nuanced, because I have some experience with my own grandfather who emigrated from the former Soviet Union to Germany at the age of 70. And he was treated there as a refugee, which meant that he was given access to essentially free or largely free healthcare. Now, the German system isn't as restrictive as some of the single payer proposals that have been made or implemented in the English speaking world, in that there's still a private healthcare system in Germany, but there's also government funding and there's some government provision of healthcare services. And that system gives a certain social safety net so that people without significant resources can still get a particular standard of care. So my grandfather had some health issues, and it was surprising to me to have learned after he died at the age of 91 that he had actually been experiencing some heart problems since his early 70s, but the system kept him alive for about 20 years. So I am thankful for that. And I know that had he emigrated to the United States instead of to Germany, the cost of his care could have been well above $1 million. So that is one perspective that I have. And another perspective that I have is one of the advantages of a private healthcare system, at least as articulated throughout the decades by more libertarian leaning thinkers, including myself, is that a private healthcare system maximizes choice and reduces rationing of care and reduces wait lists for care. Unfortunately, in the United States, the wait lists have been privatized. So health insurers in the United States, even though they're nominally private, they can have a great deal of political influence as well. And they have taken to what is called prior authorization or what is called utilization review, which are effectively external veto mechanisms upon the choices of doctors and patients regarding what care they might receive. So that's one area where in the United States, there might be less patient choice than might appear at first glance as compared to a primarily government-funded healthcare system. Now, on the other hand, as you pointed out, the United States does still lead the world in cutting-edge medicine and medical innovation. If people want to get really advanced, top-of-the-line medical procedures, they will come to the United States. And if it's a matter of life or death, and they have the money to spend, they may be willing to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for that experimental treatment that will prolong their lives. What's also interesting is in the United States, if one survives to about the age of 75, the conditional life expectancy thereafter is comparable to the life expectancy in European countries. So most of the deaths in the United States that contribute to the lower life expectancy at birth, as it's called, are deaths in middle age. And they're primarily deaths of despair among white men, generally in less affluent areas or from less affluent backgrounds, but one can discuss what causes that. It could be essentially from a rough life, from economic stresses, from societal disintegration and responses to those like alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide, etc. And I have some familiarity with that from my experience of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where male life expectancy declined to the late 50s as a result of the displacement that a lot of people experience. And what's fascinating too is female life expectancy did not decline nearly that much. So female life expectancy when the Soviet Union collapsed stayed in the 70s, and male life expectancy rebounded somewhat since that time. But it's interesting too that it may be essentially a generalized societal and economic uncertainty that damages the lives of males more so than females and leads to overall lower life expectancies. I could also say for American females, their life expectancies are closer to European female life expectancies than for American males. So these are just some of my thoughts. I would have more thoughts about China and that dynamic. I will highlight a comment by Rudy Hoffman here that I think will reinforce what you said, Stefan. He has been watching tons of videos about public works projects in China, and these may be propaganda, but the progress and modernity are astounding. So what I will say on China is we need to learn to be as, let's say, welcoming of large-scale technological projects, particularly visible technologically based achievements that are happening in China, that are happening in Dubai, that are maybe even happening in Saudi Arabia right now, but somehow the Western countries, including the United States, have forgotten the importance of doing that, and maybe even some of the know-how involved in doing that. So those are some of my thoughts in response, but your comments were truly fascinating, Stefan, and I'm interested in what David has to say as well in response to them.
So let's pick up the theme of China, because there is a narrative that China is going to dominate the world because of many of the factors that both Gennady and Stefan have pointed out. But there is a counter-analysis which I'm prone to. It is that there's two kinds of innovation. One of them sort of incremental or stepwise innovations, when you're exploiting things that are already reasonably well understood. And the top-down economy is pretty good at that. And so China is very good at catching up and doing incremental modifications. But to do radical innovation requires a more decentralized, liberal state of the economy. And there is an analysis I'm drawing on now. It's by Carol Benedict Frey. And the name may vaguely ring bells to some of you because Frey and Osborne in 2013 were the two Oxford economists who pointed out the possibility that large numbers of jobs in the future would be taken over by AI. So this was sort of the grandfather of all these discussions about jobs being displaced by AIs, the grandfather of academic research into it. Anyway, so Carol Benedict Frey, still at Oxford, just has a new book on the end of progress. How economies, which were at one stage blossoming and booming, get into stagnation. And there are plenty of examples throughout history. And his view is that both America and China are poised at the possibility of no longer being radically innovative enough, partly because in China there is more control from the top. They had some regional flexibility for a while, but now they're more and more under the single watchful eye of Xi Jinping and the Communist Central Party. And although they're very good at building houses, incredibly good at building houses, large number of buildings are unoccupied because there's no longer the need for them. So there is one scenario which says that China can catch up and maybe even slightly leap forward, But for the true innovations that are still needed in AI, and here I agree with what Gennady was saying from Peter Voss and others, which is that we probably need some quite radical thinking to truly make the biggest progress in AI. And so that may not come from China. It may not come from the US either, because as Carol Benedict Frey also argues, he did this in a recent London Futurist podcast episode, what's happened in the US recently, it's similar to what's been said in the chat, is that some of the foundations for radical innovation have been subverted. One of them is immigration, bright immigrants. Another is the independence of universities. Another is true respect for free speech rather than a pretend respect for free speech. And so there are possible scenarios in which neither the US nor China are the host for the next innovation. So that's worth pointing out, I think. And my bigger point is, I think many of the older kind of divisions, many of the older philosophical classifications, many of the older ways of thinking about the world, they're all outrunning their usefulness. And in this new world in which AI is turning everything upside down, in which there are many other changes, we need new flexibility of thinking, and the old categories no longer work, which is why what Stefan's trying to do, what we transhumanists as a whole are trying to do, is very important. As for AI and creativity, which is part of what may be sparking the new lease of innovation and taking us further forward, I think creativity has two aspects to it. One is coming up with lots of crazy ideas that sort of make sense, and the other one is the selection, as is pointed out. So in good creative teams, you get lots of youngsters who fire off all kinds of crazy brainstorming ideas, and then the older, smarter guys say, this is the one that works, this is the one that works. Well, I have to say that AI is going to get better at doing the choosing as well as the coming up with crazy. Why is it being better in choosing? Because AI can watch what humans do as well, and AIs can be trained by which of the crazy ideas get liked by humans. So I think in the not too distant future, we will have AIs that are outperforming humans in creativity, not just in occasional ideas, but in coming up with fascinating new engineering principles, fascinating new works of art, fascinating new music, fascinating new plots, fascinating new theories of science, in part by this division of labor, the creativity of ideas, and then the selection of, gosh, an AI will say, I know the humans are going to like this, let's advance this. So I see faster change coming. But if I can dovetail now, continue this discussion back to the dangers of that, because we talked about bad people can get access to some of this as well. And there are bad things happening in Europe as I speak. There are cyber hacking of some of the airports here. So in Brussels Airport, in Berlin Airport, the system has been knocked out that allows people to choose when desks are shared between different airlines. When you go to check in, one day it's maybe Brussels Airlines, the next day it's EasyJet. The system that performs that checking has been hacked, and European air travel is significantly affected. Why are people hacking? We don't know exactly in this case, but we do know other cases. Sometimes people are after money. Sometimes people are just angry with the world. Sometimes people are just showing off. And what does AI have to do with this? Well, AI can give people more ideas. People can ask AI, how would I do this? And of course, the vanilla AIs will all say, I'm not going to tell you. I'm forbidden from telling you. But everybody figures out ways in which you can get the system jailbroken. And of course, modern AIs have got constitutional layers that try to prevent you jailbreaking them, but people can also find ways of doing a double level jailbreak, which gets in at the top level and it gets in underneath too. So the risk is that the kinds of people who are either just hacking for lols or hacking for anger, hacking for money, like the North Koreans do, hacking into our systems, they will be more powerful as a result of getting access to these large language models with their extra creativity. And worse, the problem with many of these AI systems are that nobody really understands them anyway. So you might have a bit of malware that has some AI inside it, and you think you know what it's going to do, and it gets out of control, and it ends up causing much worse problems than before. And no system of rights is going to fix that, which is why I'm afraid we're going to have some kind of monitoring and, dare I say it, some restriction on open source, much though I have previously in my life been a great fan of open source. So in this point, I'm going to echo some of Stefan's caution that we have to, again, undo some of the traditional philosophical classifications. People who have previously said open source, open source, open source, will have to say open source, but we can't do it in this stage. So we need to be aware and wise about what AI possibilities there are, and also consider new frameworks, new institutions. Stefan, you've been listening for a long time. I'm sure you've got lots to come back to what Gennady and I have been saying.
Yeah, you've both raised some wonderful points, in particular when it comes to the arts and creativity. Sort of first, I want to, yeah, Gennady, you mentioned some human curating is needed, and I wouldn't put it like that. I wouldn't, because that in the end sort of puts human into the role of we're just putting something together which would work. I actually think this is so far what we're doing when we're using LLMs. We ask a prompt, and whenever we ask for a new response, we get a new response, and the new responses are excellent. All of the responses are somehow intriguing and fascinating. Some work slightly better than others. And then we can benefit from brainstorming. We can benefit enormous. We take something, but we realize in the end, something's not quite right, or this word I wouldn't have chosen. I need to substitute that word with a different one. I need to rephrase. And so this is still, so it's not, so I would say the way I use the terminology is sort of innovations being done, but sort of the creativity is the human engagement with, and the act of choosing and maybe twisting and altering what sort of the response we get from an AI. And we've seen enormously wonderful things. I'm very much engaged. I wrote a book on the philosophy of posthuman art. It just came out in Greek translation. More translations are coming out next year in Italian translation, and so on. And and I've worked a lot with artists, with Stella Arc, with Eduardo Pac. A friend of mine, Matthias, he had a project. He got his PhD in Harvard on Beethoven musicologists. And they said, look, there are sort of fragments from Beethoven's 10th Symphony, 15, 20 seconds. And, let's create Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which he didn't compose. And so he asked, in the end, it was Deutsche Telekom, which supported the project with enormous amount of money. So he got some composers and computer programmers together. And then the Deutsche Telekom sort of said, we need 20 minutes of music. And so in the end, they got 2 movements and 20 minutes of wonderful music, having been reconstructed on the basis of like 15 seconds pieces being, but it's sort of, there was then a composer intertwining, considering sort of what happened during Beethoven's late phase. So there was a lot of human involvement, but the outcome was absolutely brilliant, and it was performed in many big concert halls all over the world. Beethoven's 10th Symphony, Beethoven's AI 10th Symphony. It's a wonderful project. And then another friend of mine, who was a very successful composer, Sven Helbig. He's with Deutsche Grammophon. His Requiem just was performed on the date of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War on the Heldenplatz in Vienna, on Austrian television. So he's an enormous, the Austrian president opened the entire event. So it was a really big event. And he said, well, look, we've got, AI has usually been recreating works of dead composers. Why should we do that with living composers? Why shouldn't we do it with himself? And so he took some of his pieces from an album of his Skills, entitled Skills, wonderful album. And he basically said, let's see what AI can do with that, and sort of taken some of the pieces he's composed, and then AI has actually spit out some alternatives, and some of them he thought they really work extremely well. And then he took them and then he orchestrated them, he twisted them a little bit as well. He worked with them, and then in many of these concerts, he replaced some of his original compositions with his sort of an AI inspired and realized, innovated by AI, but then twisted and orchestrated by himself. And I think that's a wonderful way of working with an AI. It's not cooperation. It's more incorporation, because in the end, the decisive factor here, it's still the choosing, which comes down to the human. And now I want to address sort of a very intriguing comment which David has made. And sort of and he suggested, well, even the choosing will eventually, an AI will be capable of doing, like having created 10 to 100 versions and then being able to choose, well, let's choose the version which best appeals to the public, which choose the version which best works with the intellectuals, and so on. And I'm very intrigued. That's all I can say. So far, I'm hesitant. It seems very plausible. It's a very plausible narrative. So from at least from the AI versions which we're confronted, LLMs we're confronted with right now, sort of it does make a difference. Once you are confronted as a human, you can see something's not quite, it's very good already, but it's not quite right. I need to twist it a little bit, and I know exactly what needs to be done. And this is what, as I said, this is what I call creativity. And I'm really curious whether whether or when an AI will be capable of doing that. But even if that is the case, and now let me go one step further. It is, and this is again where my hesitation comes in. Unless an AI has the consciousness and falls in love and is absolutely excited to be in love with another person, and therefore wants to compose a love song, the intention to bringing about the artwork in the first place needs that kind of motivation, where I'm hesitant that this is what an AI can realize in the near future. But sort of the other element of choosing, yes, that is so. But at least, so the intention would still be the artist, but then how much more involvement is there? And I find David's suggestion, so even the choosing is something which could be done by an AI, probably is right. It is very tempting. And then, but there's still sort of the idea comes up initially, and then maybe even the outcome, the best one, maybe that's all there is left to creativity, in the end, to deciding to enter the prompt and to say, let's put it on the concert hall. I'm going to get the money together. I've got the reputation. They want my piece, and that's why it's going to be performed in a concert hall, in an opera hall. Maybe that's all what the artist will be left to do in the future.
Well, the famous example here is the analysis of the abilities of AI to play Go. We all know that in 2016, AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol. But what's more interesting is 2 years previously, there was a whole bunch of articles and analysis which said, gosh, AIs are just reaching a wall here. It's just impossible for them to play as creatively as humans. And there's a big debate amongst the people at that stage. The computer scientists argued that, well, we might probably manage within 10 years. And the Go players said, no, it's going to take 20 years. Of course, it took neither 10 years or 20 years. It took just 2 years. And part of the breakthrough was playing a move that was so creative that took all the human commentators, including the human player, by surprise. Oh my gosh, I couldn't imagine this move being played here. And so that was an example of creativity which was not suspected at that stage, but which did come true. I'm not saying that, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, initially everyone thought it was a mistake, and then it only came out like a couple of moves later that this was a decisive preparation for actually winning the game. No, you're right. Yeah, I just want to support what you said. No, sorry for interrupting.
No. So people, I think, still have the view that AIs can't jump to a new level of creativity for art. So the usual example is if you fed an AI, didn't know anything about music at all, so it wasn't allowed to learn on music. But if you fed it a number of Beatles albums, if you gave it Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale and Help, Rubber Soul and Revolver, would it then come out with something akin to Sgt. Pepper in terms of the jump in creativity? And Sgt. Pepper, for those of you who are a bit too young, may not know, it was thought of as one of the most creative standout jumps in popular music ever. So would an AI be able to have that kind of jump? Or if you fed it Bach and Mozart, would it be able to come up with Beethoven and then Tchaikovsky? And the view is currently AIs probably couldn't do that, but I don't think we're that far away from it because it's just the trajectory that it's on. So I don't think you need to have an inner soul, an inner consciousness that we humans have got in order to come up with that similar creativity. I think that these systems can figure out their own internal logic of creativity there.
I wouldn't. I would call that. I agree. I would call that innovation, because and then the creativity still comes back at least to the say I want the LLM to create that, and that is then the decisive factor. Please create a piece with which these and these features. And that's the initial starting point. That's why this makes such a. This is also the sort of the disagreement initially concerning the understanding of AGI and or weak AI and strong AI, where sort of no, the strong AI needs to have to say I want to do that, and if you say I want to do that, you need to have a motivation which has resulted in a feeling and an emotion in a state which really makes you want to do something, and which is not the case, at least so far in an LLM. And the same would apply actually to the case of wanting to create a work of art where you say, no, this is I've got a strong desire and motivation to do so, but in the end, sort of the outcome, sort of in many cases, it's even if there's a leap of creativity or a significant step forward, you can usually analyze it as a combination of different elements which have taken place before, and this is definitely something which can be realized by a sufficiently developed AI as well.
Yes, thank you for that exchange, and it is quite fascinating to consider what creative feats AI may be capable of in the future and where it will continue to need human input or human guidance or human participation to some extent. Rudy Hoffman writes, everyone who says, yeah, but AI will never do this is destined to be wrong, as Ray Kurzweil points out. And indeed, AI systems have surpassed a lot of human expectations in recent years and even in prior decades, because the chess AI Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in 1997. So that's 28 years ago. And there has been this chain of AI breakthroughs, essentially, that has been quite remarkable. But there are still, of course, questions about where will humans have an enduring advantage. And I actually delivered a presentation recently at the VSIM, Vanguard Scientific Instruments and Management Conference, that I hope to make public soon, about my view of why humans will not be made obsolete anytime soon. So to those of you watching, stay tuned for that. Now, we have about 8 minutes left in our Virtual Enlightenment Salon, and I would like to touch on several subjects before we conclude. So one of them stems from an observation from Rudy Hoffman. He writes, we really are living in increasingly science fiction realities, and he thought these would be more fun when he read the sci-fi version, but the reality is a bit different. And he also writes, welcome to getting to see the great filter up close and personal, interesting times. And I have been of the view that we are in a great filter moment, or a period of years that I would consider the great filter from the standpoint of existential risk, as well as this being a decisive period in human history. The decisions that are made today, the outcomes that are achieved today, are going to shape the future of our civilization for thousands of years to come, if not more, and might even determine whether our civilization has a future. And it seems to me, despite all of the fascinating progress of technology and the new opportunities that it offers, certain fundamental problems of the human condition have not yet been solved in the way that transhumanism promised a solution. Of course, the biggest problem is human mortality, or at least the upper limit currently of about 122 years to human lifespans. That has not been overcome. but also in terms of societal problems. We see an increasing coarsening of public discourse, especially in the United States. Stefan, I'm sure you're aware of the polarization, the incivility, the increasing recourse to political violence that is happening in this country. And transhumanists generally have presented a hopeful view of humanity's future, a view where technology and rationality can augment human potential and lead to superior solutions, just like the thinkers of the Enlightenment have advocated for the use of reason to solve a lot of these societal problems. And yet, public discourse in particular and mainstream politics seem strangely resistant to this. And I would like your thoughts, especially from the standpoint of how Euro-Transhumanism can help with that and help to guide humanity toward more rational discourse and more genuine applications of reason, science, technology to actually solve problems that we're facing instead of descending into this polarization and unfortunately even the violence that we're seeing today.
Wonderful. That's a really amazing question, because I'm actually tackling that issue sort of in the later parts of a Euro-Transhumanism book, where I talk about the cultural elements of that entire paradigm shift, um, and also it a lot actually has to do with paternalism, totalitarianism, and actually essentialism, sort of as claiming something has universal validity. And that's one of the fundamental elements, that's one of the decisive elements which sort of Euro-transhumanism actually aims to move away from. Actually, this weakness of not claiming one presents something as truth in correspondence to the world, that's actually gain. This weakness is really a strength, a gain rather than a loss. It's also like when you encounter, rather than, I do embrace sort of course, personal rights and all that, but when you encounter then a different country, in Botswana, in Nigeria, and then you say, no, I'm coming as a white man telling you the truth about the rights. And it's sort of, it has got this colonial implication, and that can be, it's very arrogant. It can be, it's paternalistic, and many, and if you take the same stand also concerning China, that's not being taken very well. And rightly so. And so this has to do with sort of and this does not mean I'm not, of course, I'm strongly upholding. I've got autonomy and liberalism, but I'm upholding it not as an essentialist truth, but as an as good as it gets solution. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction I embrace, and I think it's a wonderful fiction, and I defend it. But it by taking a more humble stance, by taking a more self-relativizing stance, it has actually some advantageous uh, um, implication when it comes sort of to global encounters, and it has also a lot of so I'm so in the United States, we see sort of the polarization coming about. On the one hand, we have a string, and I mentioned Bannon before, sort of everything which goes along with a very, and he affirms traditionalism, like the ideal of Christianity in the Middle Ages, in a very hierarchical, essentialist, fundamentalist stance. Um, and so we have an extremely, not only conservative, really an absolutist, essentialist understanding of religion, which is being embraced here. And on the other hand, we have got the cancel culture, sort of the extreme left-wing approaches, which actually in the end, from my perspective, do have a similar kind of absolutism, a radicalism in their approach as well. And it is sort of the um, it is the encounter of two absolutes, too rigid essentialists. Even though the left is trying to overcome the essentialism, they in the end actually embrace the same kind of radical problems which are being accounted in the extreme sort of religious fundamentalist approaches. And I know that's maybe not a very popular example, but I want to highlight it nevertheless, sort of just to strengthen what I mean. Um, so we've got the criticism, the traditional conservative religious understanding would basically mean, well, sexual reproduction, that is natural law. The eyes are there for seeing, the nose is there for smelling, and the genitals are there for reproduction. And only if you use them for your reproductive purpose, only if there's a possibility of having offspring, you should have sex. And that is, you know, that's sort of the most, that is still implicit in the Catholic tradition as well, and many conservatives embrace such an understanding. And then on the other hand, we have sort of the cancel culture, which not only says no, as long as competent adults, which is what I think most transhumanists would actually affirm, not all of them, but you know, the majority of transhumanism, you know, as long as we have competent adults basically agreeing upon something, that is the decisive factor for something being morally and should also be legally legitimate encounters. In contrast, so because it's strongly rooted on a notion of autonomy, which I share, which is like widely upheld in the transhumanist context, but I do uphold, by the way, the autonomy as a fiction. It doesn't exist, but it is something which I cherish because of its implication. I think autonomy is a wonderful, and together with negative freedom, wonderful achievement, which I strongly uphold as a central element of the Euro-Transhumanist approach I'm defending. In contrast to that, sort of what the cancel culture upholds is a relational understanding of the world, is a relational understanding, so that in the end, it is not autonomy. Autonomy is being undermined always by relational structures. There is no affirmation. If their autonomy gets affirmed, then it's a relational autonomy at the most. Otherwise, this relationalism also implies that basically full consent cannot be given if a strong type of hierarchy is present. Strong type of hierarchy concerning age, concerning finances, or concerning other type of authorities. And that's why, and like one of the examples would be basically Woody Allen.
Yes.
And his encounter with and sort of falling in love with Brevin, which is the adopted stepdaughter of his former partner, to whom he was never married, by the way. And he basically came together with her when she was, as Bo said, when she was in the first year of college. So she was a competent adult. Well, she grew up in the family, but like as him being in the father's role. But in the end, and sort of here, they were competent adults basically agreeing upon staying together. And here the cancel culture.
Stefan, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I'm being told that we need to wrap. But this is a fascinating discussion, and I think we should return to it, because the contrast that you mentioned between the various essentialist strains and American political discourse in particular is one that should be explored further. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. I think your commentary in general has been quite fascinating, and hopefully we can delve into it further and learn from it so we can all live long and prosper.